All right, I would like to get this meeting started. My name is Diana Wynand. I am the chair of the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter. We host these meetings to learn, to grow our knowledge about climate science, and also to understand how we can be better advocates for climate change. So we have a great guest tonight. We have a little business that we like to take care of at the top of the meeting. The first order of business is to give our land acknowledgement. So I'm going to turn to our treasurer, Kim Neistat, to do that. Kim, would you please do that for us?
A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land, the colonization that is present in our current systems, and calls on us to be mindful of our own present participation in it. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, Quiche, Tatavian, and Chumash tribes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We appreciate that. So let me give you the formal introduction. Dr. Pablo Ortiz is a senior water and climate scientist for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. In his role, he takes the lead in identifying and developing analytic and research projects that further his team's water-related priorities. He also works on developing strategies for vulnerable sectors and populations in California to cope and adapt to the current and projected impacts of climate change, particularly related to water impacts. Dr. Ortiz earned his PhD in hydrology and water resources science from the University of California, Davis, the BS in environmental engineering from Instituto Tecnológico, I'm not getting that right, Tecnológico y de
Tecnológico.
Superiores. You say it because it looks beautiful and I don't want to mess it up. So go ahead.
Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Occidente in Mexico.
Fantastic. Well, everybody, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Pablo Ortiz. Thank you for joining us. Take it away.
Well, thank you. Super happy to be here. Thank you, Diana, for inviting me to this presentation. And just to break the ice a little bit, I'll just first tell a funny story from this morning before we get into some more important matters. So about 2 months ago, I had COVID. And since then, I have had some random days where I don't feel to my 100%. And this morning was one of those days. I was on a meeting and they asked me, so how are you doing today? And English is my second language. And I wanted to say, I'm all right. I just have some cough and my nose is congested. But instead I said, I'm all right. I just have some cough and my nose is constipated. And people mostly let it pass. They understood what I meant. So the funny part is that one person that didn't hear the full story sent me a private message and he was like, hey, sorry to hear that. Miralax and those dried prunes from Costco helped me a lot.
Oh, that's too funny.
So,
but it makes perfect sense. What you said actually makes sense. So.
Okay, great. So if you found that funny, thank you. And if you didn't, I'm really sorry, because being a climate scientist, that's by far the funniest part of my presentation today. And what I really hope to share with you today is that climate change is fundamentally transforming how, when, and where California gets water. And those changes have profound implications on the state, on the environment, and therefore on us. And with that comes a call to action for all of us to be more conscious about the ways that we live and to let our representatives know that we want them to do everything in their power to conserve our environment in California. And the last part that I want to share during this presentation is that the first and most affected by this climate crisis are our most vulnerable communities. So I'm sure that the idea that California's climate is changing is not a surprise to anyone, no, in this particular group. And as we keep increasing the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and other heat-trapping gases on the planet becomes hotter. And this, of course, includes surface and water temperatures, which modifies the climate as we know it. We know this since a long time ago. So what this slide shows is the global temperature relatively to pre-industrial levels, roughly from 1850 to 1900. Dark red means hotter, darker blue means cooler. So this was about 130 years ago, about 70 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And this is basically how it looks now. And it's actually worse because this is already from 4 years ago and it has only been getting hotter. Many of you probably already know this. 2020 tied with 2016 as the hottest year on record. And last year, 2021, was the 6th hottest year on record. So the questions relevant for the presentation today is, what does climate change mean for our water resources? And what does it mean for California? And in particular, what does it mean for the most vulnerable among us? California has a super complex water system. The squares in this map represent more than 1,300 federal, state, and local surface reservoirs across California that capture precipitation, snowmelt, and runoff. And then the color lines represent thousands of miles of canals, rivers, streams, and pipes that bring water to the state, almost 40 million residents, 10 million acres of irrigated farmland, and some of the most thriving industries in the world. There are also 515 groundwater basins that store additional water through the year, and they act as a buffer, particularly during dry years like the ones that we are having right now. And climate change is threatening to break this system altogether, to break California water system altogether, and by doing so, creating new vulnerabilities for which either our infrastructure and many of our institutions are prepared. And this breaks mean more impactful droughts and floods, damage to infrastructure, and other impacts that ultimately increases our water crisis. So from many studies, we know that climate change, again, is transforming how, when, and where California gets water. And yet there are many local water agencies, including some of the groundwater sustainability agencies, that continue to make water management decisions based on the past. And often this is because climate change is seen as too uncertain, too far away, too distant, or too difficult to integrate into the decision-making process. So let me tell you where this is coming from. There is data from 10 global climate models that we mostly use in California. These are numerical models that represent physical processes in the oceans, the surface, the land surface, and the atmosphere, of course. And these are the most complex or advanced tools that we currently have to simulating the responses of our climate to the increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then from these 10 models that we use in California, and these are the 10 models that we use because they are the ones that represents the hydroclimate of the state the better. There are many different variables, but arguably the most relevant variables for water resources that come out from these models are temperature and precipitation. And this is because from this, we can derive many other metrics that are relevant for water management. Now, if we look at projections of temperature across these 10 models, which is what I'm showing in this graph, here each color line represents a different model projection, then we see that they universally agree that annual average maximum temperatures are increasing. And climate model projections show that annual average maximum temperatures could warm by another 10 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the choices that society makes about how much to keep emitting. So actually, by now, annual average maximum temperatures in the state have already warmed by a degree Fahrenheit, and in some part of the state by even a little bit more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on where we are in the state. So the perceived uncertainty for many of the water agencies come from projections of precipitation. And precipitation is a way more complex process. And if we look at the annual average projections of precipitation across all these 10 models, it seems that it's all over the place and with a lot of uncertainty. And by that, I mean that some models project more precipitation in the future, some project less precipitation in the future for California. And if we kind of take the mean across all these 10 models, there are no meaningful changes in terms of annual volume of precipitation. So this uncertainty has been used as some sort of an excuse to avoid integrating climate change planning by, for example, some local agencies in their groundwater sustainability plans. Here are both of those charts together. Again, temperature, very clear trend upwards, and precipitation, not so much. But we are only looking at a couple of metrics. And there are many other metrics that are as relevant or even more relevant than annual average precipitation for water management. And the question is, which are these metrics and how do climate models agree on those? And this is part of the research that we did at the Union of Concerned Scientists in collaboration with other climate scientists. So the questions that we ask are, how much more precipitation is going to come as rain versus snow? Or how much more our snowpack is going to be reduced? Are there going to be more days of rain over snow and maybe potentially making the risk of flooding even higher? How is the intensity of extreme events going to change? How much more the wet season is going to be compressed on the already wet winter months, which is roughly from November to March? Or how the higher temperatures are going to dry out vegetations and soils and increase water demands? Or even questions like how much it will affect these big swings between extremely wet and extremely dry years that can lead to big infrastructure impacts like that we saw in Oroville in 2017. So using those the same 10 climate models, we put numbers on these metrics, and I'm going to show you a few of the results that hopefully will make you think about the importance of incorporating these metrics into water planning beyond what we currently have been integrating in many spaces, which are the averages of like volume of water or average changes in temperature. So global climate models agree on more yearly precipitation arriving as rain rather than snow. This is the blue shades on the right, on the left, and a drastic decline on snowpack, which is the orange shades on the right. And the ratio of rainfall to snowfall is projected to increase statewide and almost double in the high Sierras, with almost a complete loss of the snowpack at lower elevations statewide within the next 80 years. So this essentially eliminates the natural snowpack storage towards the end of the century if we continue emitting heat-trapping gases at the current rate. The snowpack storage is particularly important for California because it's a natural form of water storage in the mountains that accumulates during the winter, and then it naturally melts during the spring and summer. It fills our reservoirs, and then later we use that water for our extensive agriculture. So this is kind of a visual representation, and sadly, those landscapes on the right are becoming already more and more common. Regarding shifts in the intensity and seasonality of precipitation, the proportion of yearly precipitation that arrives in the most extreme events is also projected to increase by more than 15% across Central California. And these types of events tend to increase risk of floods or mudslides and make precipitation harder to store and to manage. So also the proportion of yearly precipitation that falls in the already wet winter months is projected to increase by 5 to 6%, but in some places up to 20% in certain places of the state. And then this requires greater water storage in a shorter time span and creates a longer and more intense dry season. Another metric that I'm not showing here, but it's also very relevant, is this increase between going from an extremely dry year to an extremely wet year. And the likelihood of these events is projected to double and even triple in some parts of the state. So these swings, again, contribute to fatal mudslides, unexpected wildfire behavior, and damage to water infrastructure. So to summarize, extremes are going to be more extreme, and we will need to change the operation of our water infrastructure. This is Oroville during the last drought from 2016 in the left, and then a year after in 2017, a very wet year, and nearly 200,000 people had to be evacuated because there was a risk for the reservoir to break and complete flood cities downstream. If you read the news, you also probably saw some of these headlines a few months ago, which was about a study from UCLA and Columbia University that found that the last 22 years have been the driest 22-year period in the Western United States in at least 1,200 years. The driest 22-year period in the last 2,000 years. And it says at least because that's how far the reconstructed data goes. So it could have been even for a longer period. This graph shows those drought conditions in the Western United States during those 22 years. And despite some wet years like 2005 here, 2010, and of course 2017, soils have been unable to recover from a soil moisture deficit since the year 2000. So since the year 2000, there hasn't been a single year in the Western United States with even at least abnormally dry or even moderate drought conditions. And this is what is called a mega drought, a dry period lasting in the order of decades. And part of why the study made so many headlines is that they also calculated that about 42% of this mega drought can be attributed to human-caused climate change. As you can see also in this graph, dry periods are coming at a rate that doesn't allow us to recover, and we are becoming more vulnerable and less resilient against droughts. So the reason for this long drought has a lot to do with climate and with changes in precipitation patterns and rising temperatures linked to human-caused climate change. But it also has to do a lot with human decisions, particularly here in California. Human decisions that have led to the overexploitation of water resources, of our rivers, of our lakes, and of our groundwater. And also by the lack of policies to protect many of these resources. And here's where I change gears a little bit and lower the scale of what I have been talking about to try to answer the question of what does this mean for the most vulnerable communities? And I will start with one story. This is the story of Jose Ornelas. And I met Jose while I was doing an interview to community members and community leaders with some of my friends at UC Merced as part of a study. And I was already, this day, the day of the interviews, it was already a little bit after sunset. And Jose had this smile this day. He was with his wife and his daughter. And Jose graduated from Fresno State University. And then he went back to his community to put a business, basically to help improve his community, which is the city of San Joaquin in the San Joaquin Valley. And while we were preparing for the interview, Jose shows a couple of videos that I'm going to show to you in a moment of water that was coming out from the faucets in houses in his community. And then he mentioned that the majority of his community was of Latinx origins, a median household of about $20,000 a year, and that the majority were farm workers. He also said there are about 500 houses in this community, but about 600 families. And what he was referring that sometimes 2 or 3 or even 4 families live in the same house. So here are the videos that he showed with us. This is how sometimes the water comes out in some of these communities. And a particular problem of these communities is that they don't know when the water is going to come out like this. So sometimes they use a washing machine, and their clothes come out stained, or they want to take a shower in the morning, the water is coming like this. And sometimes they say that they need to spend 15 to 20 minutes or even more for the water to start cleaning up. This water has high concentrations of sediments and a metal that is called manganese. Manganese, or chronic ingestion of manganese, has been linked to memory problems, anxiety, and insomnia. And during the interview and after talking about this water, we wanted to have like verbal confirmation that clean water availability was the main problem of the community. So we asked Jose, hey, Jose, what is the worst environmental problem in your community? And to our surprise, he said, our biggest problem is the air quality. And after watching our expression, he added like, well, clean water is expensive, but at least we can buy it. And no one can buy clean air. Jose was a leader in his community. He was afraid of the water, but more afraid of the polluted air. Jose died from COVID in July 2020, and maybe that bad air quality was partially responsible for it. The main economic activity, again, was or is agriculture. So this means that the people often needs to work for the very farms that are contaminating that air and that water. And the very farms that produce the food that sometimes is too expensive for them to pay for it. So can you imagine like how frustrating it may be for people working in some of these fields, irrigating with clean water coming down from the Sierras, watching sometimes flooded almond fields, and then go back home and not having clean water to drink? Like, this is how some of the frontline communities look like. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but many are surrounded by agriculture. And climate change is exacerbating conditions that leads, among other things, to droughts and wildfires that further threatening people in communities like this. Higher temperatures increase the risk of heat stroke or other direct effects on people, particularly for older workers, many of which tend to have low-income jobs like farm workers. And also higher temperatures also represent a risk for families that, for example, don't have air conditioner or can't afford to pay for the energy bills. Rising heat is also a problem during the nights because night temperatures during summers are also getting hotter, making it harder to fall asleep and to recover before another day of work. And having low sleep quality decreases things like our immune system, among other health effects. Higher temperatures also increase evapotranspiration, potentially increasing water demands, mainly from agriculture, which is a big part of the job market in many of these communities in the Central Valley and in California. And this could mean that agriculture would depend even more heavily in groundwater, which is something that we are already seeing during the previous drought and during this drought, further lowering groundwater levels that, again, mostly affect people with the less resources and reduce their water access and degrades their water quality. We don't need to wait for climate change to see that. We have already seen it many times already, but climate change is making it even worse. So during this drought that started in 2020, there have been over 1,000 reports of wells failing, going dry, or with increased concentrations of pollutants. And particularly, these reports tend to come from disadvantaged communities. Overpumping groundwater also increases the concentration of some contaminants like arsenic. And as we get more droughts, we will likely see more overpumping and therefore worse water quality. Many people in the San Joaquin Valley depend on bottled water for drinking, and this represents an extra expense for low-income communities. Some people need to go to their neighbor's house who may have a deeper well or whose water hasn't been contaminated yet, or others may need to pay for an interim tank to bring some water to their homes. In many cases, community members need to use bottled water even for cooking because they are afraid to cook with that water, often because it's heavy metals or contaminants that could even get concentrated if we boil the water. It's not like in the old days that it was bacteria, you boil the water and then you can drink it. These are different contaminants in many cases. We also have talked to people who said that they have intense headache whenever they drink the water or that they take a shower and then develop rashes. And by the way, have you ever carried one of those? Those are really heavy to carry basically every week sometimes. As we see more intense precipitation or more precipitation coming in terms of rain rather than snow, it means that we will have more water runoff in less amount of time, potentially creating more floods. And floods in disadvantaged communities also hit different because even a little bit of rain can create areas that make it difficult to cross the street, to go to the bus station, or even sometimes makes it hard to just get out of home. And here's where I switch to the part of solutions. For me, climate change, the slow motion of the government, the many greedy corporations like the fossil fuel industry have been making me feel very disempowered and frustrated. And here today, I wanted to share some personal solutions, which I hope will empower you. It may not be the technical solutions that some of you may be expecting today. We can talk about those during the questions. So these are personal solutions which I hope will empower you. First, keep doing what you are already doing and keep being involved in spaces like this and in projects like the Climate Reality Project. In essence, keep supporting the bigger picture. This picture includes other things like the energy transition, because this is a quote from a marine scientist marine biologist. Her name is Julia Baum. And she said, I have realized that the best way I can help to save the coral reefs is not to work on coral reefs, but rather to work on the energy transition. And that is because climate change is mainly caused by burning fossil fuels, which now accounts to close to 86% of the carbon dioxide emissions. And unless we rapidly transition to clean energy, all other efforts to save, in her case, the corals, and in the case of everyone, our warming planet won't matter that much. Other ways to support the bigger picture is stay informed, fight disinformation, advocate for workers' rights, and value equity alongside progress. In the terms of equity, this last point that I mentioned, I constantly ask myself if the climate change work that I'm doing is also helping to reduce the equity gap. Because I believe that equitable solutions are solutions that lead to long-lasting change. And that's what we need these times. For example, I'm part of a national team that is called the Imagination Team, with the task to envision ways to bring the water utilities to be net zero emissions. And part of my role is to make sure that we not only focus on lowering or eliminating emissions, but also on building equity. Because what difference would it make if San Francisco has a water utility that is net zero, or San Diego or New York, if these big cities have water utilities that are net zero, if there are still so many people without reliable access to drinking water supply? So the next time that you are developing a project, talking with people, I invite you to ask yourself if the work that you are doing is helping to reduce the equity gap. Also focus on local action and advocacy. While it is, of course, undeniable that we need global action, a lot of the change, particularly in terms of equity, starts locally. And this is a great example of it, like having local people organizing and just creating spaces like this. So I have been, for example, very impressed by many grassroots organizations and community leaders, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, which is the area where I focus most of my work, that are helping to facilitate change. And some examples, in occasions, doesn't even have to be with climate change. Some examples of local groups that inspire me include those that were fighting for a new school in their communities, or making free masks and delivery to people for free at the beginning of the pandemic. Another was a school director who, while schools were closed, he used the buses of the school to deliver lunches to children, because for some of the children, it was the only meal of their day. And also because action inspires action. So the next time that there is a meeting, for example, in your city council, think about going, find local volunteering opportunities or other ways to take action. Also, share with others how climate change is affecting you personally. There have been surveys asking people like if they know about climate change, or if they know that climate change is happening, and most people say like, yes, of course. Then they ask them if climate change is bad, and most people say like, oh yes, of course. But then they ask if climate change is affecting them personally, and many people say no, or at least not yet. And this planet is our home. It is like if my home is on fire, and my brother's room is on, it's like my brother's room is on fire with my brother on it. And I say that it's not affecting me. So how long until that fire reaches my room, or how long until I realize that I need to do something? I will share here how climate change is affecting me personally, because I think sharing personal experience is important, particularly when we talk about science. Mixing science or rational aspects with emotions, I believe, are very powerful. I spend my days doing research about drought, wildfires, extreme heat, species going extinct, ecosystems collapsing. And with that, climate change is affecting my emotions, my sleep, and my energy. And I live in the Central Valley, so the heat is also physically affecting me. The smoke from wildfires definitely impacts my health. And I'm privileged enough so that I have the means and the resources to adapt to many of these changes. But I need to be conscious that that's not the case of many families and many other people across the world. So the solution here is to create a movement to make everyone realize that climate change is something that affects us all. So think about how climate change is affecting you personally, share it with others, share it with your friends, with your families, in a presentation, in a blog, in a TikTok, wherever feels more comfortable to you. And help create this bigger movement. And the last thing is think about your reasons for hope. Think about your reasons for hope and for action. In my case, my reasons for hope are people like you, people interested enough to stay until this part of the presentation. And I also get hope from my family, from my partner, from my friends, my colleagues at the Union of Concerned Scientists and many other organizations working to create change. I get hope from the youth with hunger for change, and a lot of hope from many community leaders that are in the front lines of climate change, helping to create action. So thank you again for inviting me, and I can take some of your questions now.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate the way you leaned into the vulnerable communities. It's very important for us to acknowledge that. We do have an environmental justice group within the chapter, and so that is something that we look at as well. So let me just turn on the chat. And so feel free to go ahead and put your question into the chat. And then what I'm going to do while you do that is invite Andy Hatala. Andy is on our leadership team, and he's also the co-chair of the LA chapter. And Andy came to us when we started thinking about, this was last fall, we started thinking about what are our priorities for legislative bills. And we had a list of 5, and Andy came and said, we've got to make water one of our priorities. And so we did. So we've been looking at legislative bills through the lens of water this whole year. And recently Andy led a study group. Who's on the water study group that worked on some questions and topics? Raise your hand. Joanne was there, and some others.
Melanie, Mitty, a whole group of people.
Mitty, Cindy. Yeah, we had like at least a dozen or more people. And so Andy is going to go ahead, ask Andy to kick off the questions or to do a follow-up on one of the topics that we were zeroing in on and connect that. So Andy, I'll just turn it over to you and invite everyone while he's doing that to please go ahead and go ahead and put your question in the chat, and we will elevate that, ask it.
Perfect. Thank you, Diana. And thank you, Pablo, for speaking to us and for sharing your expertise. I am going to adjust some of these because you did such a good job addressing equity. So I'm going to change this first question. Could you describe for us the most effective and equitable solution or solutions to mitigating and adapting to drought and basically ensuring access to water? And I'll say it again, we need to have the water, but we also need to make sure that it's clean. So do you mind sharing what you think is most impactful for us to do for those communities, but also just so that we have that water that we don't have right now?
Yes, excellent question. And I wish there were like a single thing to say here, no? But I think it's the combination of many different things. And among this is achieving equitable energy transition. That's the bigger picture. But then also things like collaboration. We need way more collaboration within like environmental groups, agriculture groups, industry. Because even though I was saying many probably not so good things about agriculture, I don't like to put all the agriculture in the same place. Agriculture can even be part of the solution if it's like a regenerative, organic agriculture that is not a business for creating money, but the means for creating the food for all of us. Also, things like improving monitoring and access to water. These are the most technical things that I didn't mention. No, monitoring access to water and information. We need way more data to develop better projections, better models. We need also reduction of soil and water pollution, because we already have limited freshwater resources. And in the case, again, of California, we are polluting many, and not only in California, all over the world, no? We are polluting many of those already limited freshwater resources, making the available clean water resources even smaller. So we definitely need to stop that soil and water pollution. green infrastructure. I was very happy that someone is going to talk more about that, I think in a couple of weeks or something. Green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. No? Water conservation. And one that I particularly like a lot is water education. We don't take sometimes education too serious with our younger generations. I have gone to some like schools and talk about climate change, and I'm often surprised that many people have, or many children haven't even heard about climate change, and that surprised me sometimes. There are more maintaining and modernized infrastructure is another one, and more than creating new infrastructure is changing the operation of the current infrastructure that we have. Because in many cases, some of the reservoirs, conveyance channels are still being operated based on information from the past. And I see many more questions, so I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you. Diana, would you like to ask any from the chat, or I have one more that I could actually fold in because, again, it ties both our chapters together so strongly, and Pablo touched on it.
Yes, go ahead
Okay.
and do that. And
Perfect. So Pablo, you did a great job. You talked about sustainable agriculture, and I just want you to know that the LA chapter and the San Fernando Valley chapter have committees focused on sustainable agriculture. I know this is a broad question, but if you could you describe a little bit more about what you think sustainable agriculture in California, in Mexico, and in the Southwest looks like, since again, we have similar, again, not the same, but similar climates?
Yes, for me, it means recovering a lot of our soils. We have been depleting the nutrients, microbiome of the soils. And if we start recovering these soils, then we can naturally have these nutrients, reduce fertilizers, which uses a bunch of fossil fuels to develop them, and basically start recovering some of the ecosystems that we have been destroying for the past 150-ish years here in California. So there are some examples like this, one close to LA of a regenerative farm. There is even a documentary that I recommend. It's called The Biggest Little Farm. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend it a lot. If you have seen it and you like it, then share it with other people, because I think that is a fantastic example of how we can, I would say, reimagine agriculture, but it's not even reimagining. It's just to go back to what was done before industrial agriculture came. No? I feel like I'm missing one integral part that's what I was hesitating, right? Is protections for our farm workers. The agriculture of the future needs to have safer jobs with good wages, so that the people that is actually helping to harvest the food of everyone here and everywhere have decent living conditions, which is often not the case.
Thank you, Pablo. I'm really glad that you brought that up. This last one is a little bit more technical, but again, this is a favor for Melanie because we defer to your expertise. In your opinion, is it more efficient and better to have a decentralized sort of water distribution system that is more local? So again, based much more on like a regional setup, or is it better to have a more centralized structure for, again, collecting that water, purifying it, and distributing it? Again, it just helps us in our advocacy to know really what to ask for from local officials as well as state and national officials.
Yeah, excellent question. And the short answer is, if you are in a new place, then local sources and local uses. However, we already passed that ship here in many places of the United States. Like, we certainly cannot go back for a city like LA, no, to have all their own local water sources. That would be extremely expensive. For example, thinking in desalination, extremely inefficient. With the current technologies that we have for this technology, is very energy intensive. And even if we solve that energy problem, it's at the moment hard, then we still have the problem of environmental degradation when we dumped a lot of this extra concentrated saline water into the ocean. So it's just very complex, and it's at this point is a combination of these different sources where it still makes sense to bring local sources, local uses. My personal opinion is that's better, but there are some places where we simply cannot do that in an easy way, and it will be a very major transition to get there. In the case of LA, probably, sorry, some of you know, no? A lot of the water comes from the delta. All the water comes from what it was Owens Lake, and now that lake is completely dry. We also in LA get a lot of water from the Colorado River. So getting all that water from the ocean in this case, no, or from the aquifers, it would be really, really difficult.
So short answer is it depends.
Yes, it depends.
Diana, do you want to do some of the questions from the chat?
Yeah, I'm going to voice the question. And actually, this is sort of a composite because I feel that there are a few people that are asking similar things. So let me just ask their questions, but I think there's an underlying similarity in them. Robert asked, should we try to capture precipitation building projects? Joanne says, is there a way to collect rainwater in a major way as opposed to just your backyard? And Polly asked, what is State Governor Wade Crowfoot doing to meet the water challenge? Again, reusing water, storing it, since the snowpack is going to be reduced. So it's about, capturing, storing, any projects that might support growth in that area.
Yes, and here is where I like to talk more about the green infrastructure or nature-based solutions. So for example, my personal perspective is that in places, particularly in California, we don't need more concrete reservoirs and cement reservoirs, no? The storage space of our aquifers is many, many, many times bigger than all the water stored in our reservoirs, surface reservoirs, lakes, rivers, etc. So some of these kind of new solutions, alternatives is during very wet years when we have a lot of water coming down from the rivers, we start recovering some of what used to be the natural floodplains. And those natural floodplains can help to recharge some of this water, so store what more naturally in the aquifers, the soil basically. That's part of it, and this all go back to managing our forests better too. It's like the whole hydrologic cycle. No, we need to have at every point of the cycle even small actions for the water to get into healthy forests. The forests help to clean the water. If that water then is able to get into the valleys and infiltrate, then we have cleaner water that will later at least reduce some of the pollution that we currently have in some of our groundwater aquifers. What else? The other part, you already mentioned it, is changing the operations of our current reservoirs. Now we have an earlier snowmelt from the mountains. Temperatures are getting hotter earlier in the year. And then it's increasing the mismatch between when the water is available and when the water is needed during summer, mostly for agriculture. So we need to start changing some of that operations on our current reservoirs and current infrastructure so that we can utilize or use some of that water. I'm forgetting something else, but we can, what was the other part of the question?
I think you addressed it about collecting rainwater and using, storing it, utilizing the snowpack. Yeah. Something you said dovetails perfectly, as I mentioned early on our call, but I think before the meeting started, we have been very involved with the Sepulveda Basin, which is 2,000 acres of federally owned property along the LA River here in the San Fernando Valley. And I'm going to turn it over to Melanie Winter, as I mentioned, Executive Director of the River Project. Melanie has taught us the value of developing or returning the river to its natural flow, which is something you just made reference to, and how that could have a beneficial impact to the river as a whole. So Melanie, I will just turn it over to you and let you voice your question to Pablo, if you would.
Hi, thanks so much. I really appreciate the focus on justice for workers in the Central Valley, and it's going to be a lot of change as lands are retired and water rights are adjusted and flood mar moves forward, and it's keeping justice centered and all that is going to be key. I just wondered if in any of your research and your interviews of folks you had also been engaging with the indigenous tribes with respect to water rights, land back, water back. To my mind, the overlap of that with the challenges we're facing with our infrastructures, with the Colorado, with the Bay Delta, with the massive distribution systems that we built that won't be able to continue operating, and sort of throwing into the mix justice for indigenous, and then looking at the realities of those centralized systems and climate change makes it one of the most complicated fields of work out there. But yeah, I just wanted to know if you had been working with indigenous much, and if you could speak to that.
I haven't worked a lot with, at least like indigenous from Northern America, well, the United States, no? I have done some work with indigenous communities, but back when I was in Mexico, and then some of those communities that immigrated recently to the United States, communities mainly from the states, for example, of Oaxaca or Chiapas or Michoacan, that came to this country. What you said is extremely important, and I think that's another of the solutions to climate change, and is returning some of the land to indigenous communities. And they knew way better how to manage the land sustainable that we do. They were unjustly extirpated from their own territories, and I think it's not only the right thing to do, it's also a really good solution for many of the problems that we are already having. So in terms of policy, it will need to be funding for either buying out this land, or if it's already government land, then just straight out return some of those lands. And it's something that is extremely difficult. Well, not difficult to do, but it's just a topic I don't know enough, even though I would like to know more. So I'll just leave it at there, and there are other experts that could talk better than me about.
Thank you, Pablo. Someone mentioned a California group called Regenerative Water Alliance. They're encouraging formation of a network of watershed wisdom councils to educate and engage local communities in aspects of water conservation restoration. You mentioned the value and the importance of education. What's your view about the viability of this approach? Is it sort of everything helps, or are you familiar with this particular group? Or
I'm not familiar with this group, but from what I'm understanding, is like basically education coming from tribal communities on all their practices, and I think that would be fantastic. That would be a great way to integrate indigenous communities as stakeholders and do like some sort of cross-pollination of learnings and develop the solutions that we need to see. it's not along those lines, but I saw one, someone sent me a private question in the chat, and is what do I think about the toilet? Well, wrongfully people call it toilet to tap, no? Obviously, with that name, it's not very attractive. I would change the name to something else, because it's cleaning the water, and that's what happens naturally in the hydrologic cycle. Most likely, some of us at some point have drank dinosaur pee that evaporated at some point, and we are drinking it now. So it's kind of the same. It's just accelerating a little bit the hydrologic cycle, and then at the end, it's clean water, which is what we need. So just it's more like a stigmatized, but at the end of the day, it's clean water that we can actually drink.
Right. I'm going to pitch it back to Andy, who is working off of the list of questions that we all worked on. So go ahead, Andy. Why don't you ask a few more of those?
Thank you, Diana. And again,
At the
everyone in the
time-
chat, I just wanted to make sure that we got your questions answered as well. So
We're doing pretty good. I think there's a couple that we want to get back to if we have time, but I also noticed that we are running out of time and don't want to hold Pablo. I didn't know you were experiencing some symptoms, some COVID symptoms. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope we don't run you ragged tonight, but go ahead, Andy.
yeah, just let us know when we need to stop, Pablo. Your health is most important. So you talked about toilet to tap, which is great. So in your opinion, should we again try and do both? Should we try and do everything, which is again recycling the water as well as rainwater capture, or do you think one is better than the other? Because again, like rainwater capture and the things that you talked about, that would reduce some of the flooding potentially. So I just wondered if you had an opinion on what to prioritize, because again, funding is limited.
Of course, it depends on where you are. In some places, it makes more sense sustainably, economically to do the water treatment. In others, it may make more sense to do the rainwater capture. So really listen to local experts, local science, the numbers, and take decisions based on that.
Perfect. And then Cindy had a question again about agriculture. You had mentioned nature-based solutions and the impact of recharging aquifers. Is that the best thing to do? Are there other things that can be done or that should be done to recharge the aquifers and really rebuild those, repair them, as well as restore groundwater just in general?
Mm-hmm. Groundwater recharge is a particularly good one, but cannot be the only one. For example, some of the estimates in the San Joaquin Valley is that if we are able, hypothetically speaking, if we were able to capture those water from, not all the water, because you need to leave some water on the river, no? But the available water from these really big flood events, and you're able to capture all of it, which is a big question. It will only account for about 30% of the like yearly overdraft or difference that we have. So that solution is really great, 30%, and it's 30% estimated. No, it's a really big number, but it's still far from being enough. So great solution. We need many more.
Okay. Fair enough. And then last one, because this one does tie into what individuals can do as well as what the state can do, localities. Do you think that native landscaping and sort of restoring plant life, or at least changing out plant life, is beneficial to, again, reduce erodification as well as to that groundwater recharge?
Sorry, can you mention that again?
Basically, it is re-landscaping and basically employing native plants. So again, restoring those native plants, or at least making sure that we're utilizing native plants again in our yards, at a local, like from a local and state standpoint. Is that a reasonable approach to, again, recharging those aquifers, collecting more of that water, and again, limiting the impact of the drought or reducing the impact of the drought?
I believe so, and I think the key is on the vegetation that was naturally there. No, these, for example, I don't know if some of you are familiar with like cover crops, which is like you have some agriculture, and then during winter times, you put some crop to cover some of the soil. It grows, and then some people were like, well, that's more vegetation, so it's more water use. And it's way more complex than that. And that's what happened with native plants and native vegetation. Because yes, maybe part of the plant will use some of the water, but also what happens is that we recuperate a lot of the organic matter. We create new paths in the soil for some more water to infiltrate. So at the end, what the current science is showing that it is that in most places, the water balance is actually in favor of using less water when it's prolonged through a long time. So this helps us to recover a lot of the nutrients from the soil, to create paths for the water to infiltrate, to capture carbon, which is a really good solution for climate change, and many other benefits that could be related to, in many cases, reducing pests, reducing the need for fertilizers. If some of the cover crops that you are using are like nutrient, like nitrogen, I forgot the words, not gatherers, etc. So yes, usually looking at native plants and what they were doing before we arrived is a good approach.
Perfect. Thank you, Diana. That should cover
Yeah.
it. Folks.
I just have one quick short question because from an Instagram follower asked if the use of fog nets, also called fog collectors or fog fences, would they be a viable choice for California? Now, I haven't heard of them before, but I don't know if you have heard of that approach, but would that help us at all?
That's interesting. I don't know a lot about them. For just to give a little bit of context, this is basically some nets that, particularly in like coastal regions, could be an option to capture some of the very moist air that comes to the coast, and then these nets basically capture some of that water. No, I don't know a lot, but my question would be how big it needs to be that net for us to have a minimum amount of water. So depend on how big this solution needs to be. And also, sadly, on that topic, in some areas, this fog is, in others is being increased, in others is being reduced, and this is affecting some native plants in some regions along the coast that dependent on that fog.
And you mentioned quality of the water. You showed amazing pictures, but also there's pesticides and toxic chemicals, as well as plastics now that we have to worry about being part of the water. So the whole filtering thing is another aspect. But we are running out of time here. And listen, can you just come back every month? Because this is a conversation I think that we really want to continue. I'm kidding, Pablo. It's okay. But really, we actually may want to do a part 2 because I feel like we're just scratching the surface with some of this in our understanding and in our appreciation of the science that you've shared with us tonight. So maybe in 2023, we can have you back and we can continue the conversation if you're up for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pablo.
I invite everybody to unmute and express your appreciation for Pablo for coming to be with us tonight, even though he didn't feel well. And
thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Feel
you.
better.
Thank you.
You're always welcome to
Thank you,
present at the LA
Pablo,
chapter.
so much for coming.
Feel
Thank you.
better.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Pablo. All right, guys, well, terrific meeting. I love it when we get to just sit back and listen to someone as knowledgeable and involved with this as Pablo was. He's doing such great work, and it's really good to take in what he could share with us. So we need a part 2 next year, Andy. All right, so let's
agree.
think about it. All right. Good.
Also, we can always
All right,
partner with the LA chapter. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love that. Let's do that. So thanks everyone for coming. Have a great night. Appreciate you being on the call, and we'll
Thank
see
you.
you next time, hopefully.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.